My guest says, they gaslight, we ignite. She joins us to discuss how corporations are destroying our health and blaming us for it. She goes further to discuss what we can do to reclaim our health. You're listening to the PHEC Podcast, episode 434. Welcome to the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations Podcast, where we have honest conversations with public health professionals who are creating meaningful impact in communities around the world. They know that the field of public health touches everything. I'm your host, Dr. Charlotte Hughes Huntley, and today we're exploring the fascinating journey of our guest and diving into another conversation that bridges different perspectives with the practical wisdom you need to fuel your impact. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this episode. My guest returns to this podcast and brings powerful insights to this episode that you don't want to miss. My name is Dr. Charlotte Huntley, and I lead an epidemiology consulting firm that supports large nonprofit organizations and community health foundations. We specialize in a variety of community assessments, workshops, and trainings, ultimately helping our clients communicate their health information in plain language to their community partners, as well as the broader communities they serve. The support we provide often falls in categories of strategic planning and sometimes capacity building. So please reach out to us through our website, drchuntley.com. We'd be happy to meet with you and explore how we might be able to support your organization. Links will be provided in the show notes. I am excited to introduce you to my guest on this episode, or I should say reintroduce you. She first appeared on our podcast back in episode 223, right after completing her first TED Talk, which was entitled Square Peg, Round Hole, Why Our Approach to Health is All Wrong and How to Fix It. Be sure to check out that episode and her TED Talk if you haven't done so already. We'll provide links to all of that in the show notes as well. She recently launched Gaslit by Corporations, which is a project focused on building community power and reducing corporate influence to advance public health and equity. She joins us today to share fresh insights. Let me formally introduce her to you, and then I'll connect our conversation. Dr. Vinu Ilakkuvan is founder and principal consultant of Pop Health, a public health practice that partners with community coalitions to drive policy and systems change. She is passionate about addressing the root causes of health shaped by corporate and political forces, and recently launched Gaslit, a project focused on building community power and reducing corporate influence to advance public health and equity. As a lecturer and policy consultant with George Washington University, she has worked with the university's Center for Health and Healthcare in Schools and Center on Commercial Determinants of Health. She was also selected to be a 2025 Seeding Disruption Fellow with the Equity Lab. Vinu began her public health career coordinating the Virginia Department of Health's bullying prevention program and later evaluating the National Truth Anti-Smoking Campaign and managing policy project at Trust for America's Health. Vinu received her DrPH from George Washington University, her MSPH from the Harvard School of Public Health, and bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering and economics from the University of Virginia. Let's connect my conversation with Vinu right after we highlight our sponsor for this episode. Public health is about connection, and now you have a space built just for that. The PHEC Podcast Community App is where public health professionals come together to collaborate, share ideas, and support one another. Inside, you'll find exclusive events like Power Hour, which is our virtual co-working event. It helps you connect with others and boost your productivity. You'll also have direct access to conversations with other public health professionals from around the world, and even guests from previous podcast episodes. We're more than a podcast. We're a thriving community. Be a part of it. Download the PHEC Podcast Community App today and join us. Hi, Vinu. Welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
It's been great. We were chatting for quite a while before I hit record, just catching up a little bit. Now, you were on our podcast, and by the time this episode comes out, I will have looked up the dates and the
Yes,
details,
sure.
exactly when, and I'll make sure that everyone can connect to that episode. It is so much fun to have a guest come back after a few years and just update on the journey, because so much changes so fast, especially with the way public health is these days. But for people who are not familiar, maybe not have heard that episode or just are new to you, just would you mind introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Vinu, and I am founder and principal consultant at Pop Health. So, Pop Health is a public health consulting practice that really we are focused on working with community coalitions and collaboratives that are trying to advance policy and systems change around health in their communities. So that's what I've been doing for the last, I think, coming up on a decade soon. So have really loved being rooted in community through this work with coalitions. And that's really what prompted me to start Pop Health initially. And I'm sure we talked about this a bit the last time I was here, but I had been working in public health nonprofits that were really doing policy and systems change work at that kind of 30,000 foot level. And I loved it conceptually, but I really missed feeling rooted and grounded in community. I started my public health career in a state health department, driving to schools all across the state of Virginia. And I was like, I love the policy systems change lens and that work, but I miss being grounded in community. And I also think we are missing things when we're not grounded in community. So I started Pop Health to really try to bridge that gap and situate myself and my work at that intersection between communities and changing policies and systems to make community health better. And what I do now, or what I have added now, is really an outgrowth of that, being in communities, working on policy and systems change work, and honestly realizing how often that lends itself to frustration because we want to change policies and systems and we are unable to. So I started asking myself, why is that, right? We know how powerful policy and systems change is for public health. Why are we unable to change them? And I think a big part of that answer is, as much as we talk about going upstream in public health, we are not going far enough upstream. And further upstream from the social needs and the social determinants and the structural determinants that we talk about is something that I don't think we often name explicitly in public health, and that's power. So who has the power to shape our stories? Who has the financial power? Who has the political power? And I think, at least in our society right now, an outsized amount of power lies in the hands of for-profit corporations and corporate interests. And oftentimes it is their influence, direct and indirect, that's getting in the way of us being able to change policies and systems. And so I started Gaslit, which is short for Gaslit by Corporations, Ignited by Community. And it's right now a website, newsletter, blog at gaslitbycorporations.com, and really just trying to both reshape the narrative around what's harming our health, but also reshape the narrative around what we can do about it and how much power we can have collectively.
Well, you did that so well. And there's a ton to unpack out of what you just said. First, I want to just mention, I think that drive for passion is something that resonates with probably everyone listening to this podcast. I think when I listened back to the first episode of this podcast, I was talking about community of listeners and coming together. And we've had multiple iterations of what community looks like. But even this year with us, we launched an app, a community for podcast listeners. Still, that way of, for me, thinking about how I'm serving public health professionals, a way for us to come together, to be in community, to talk about whatever it is that's coming up after so many years of doing this, and hearing from people around the world, and just that sense of community, even in my work. Like you, Alita, consulting firm and serving our communities. A lot of them are the tribal nations around the country. And I found myself craving those opportunities. And I love to be in community, sitting in the room, in spaces, there's so much that happens when you are, whether it's in a virtual space or you're in person, but really being connected and genuinely interested in engaging in what those conversations with communities is very powerful. So I definitely get that. We're very much on the same page with that. I think that it's also interesting that you founded this Gaslit by corporations in how you've summarized it. Like I said, we're going to unpack a lot, but my next question is why Gaslit?
So I think I come from my public health training was in academia, as with many of us. And I think that we often use a lot of jargon and a lot of words that don't resonate with our community members, just regular people. And so a lot of what I just shared about corporations and corporate interests and their influence in public health academia is referred to as the commercial determinants of health. And I've worked with a Center on Commercial Determinants of Health at GW and co-written a chapter on a textbook on that topic and all sorts of things. But I just found myself feeling like this is not a term that is going to resonate with the public. And this is a conversation. This reshaping of the narrative around what shapes our health is a conversation we need to be having in and with community, not just in and with academics. And so this was a very intentional choice to use language that would resonate. And it's not just resonate, right? Because there's probably a less incendiary term I could have used or whatever. I was intentionally wanting to certainly say what I meant, but also say it in a way that was going to grab people's attention and be forceful. I think this is something that we often shy away from in the name of professionalism, in the name of academic rigor or whatever. But I feel like it puts up a wall between us and community. And so I really wanted the language to be direct. And that does mean, even just recently, I submitted something for a conference and kind of got a response back of, we love this topic. We want you to present on it. Can we think about reframing the title, right? And I share that to say that there is a lot of pushback. And another part of the reason I started Gaslit is because I kept looking around, wishing that more people, in general, but especially in public health spaces, because I'm like, this is what we are here to do. This is what we care about. So why then are we not hearing more people talk about this, right? And I really feel like part of the issue is that when you work for an academic institution, a nonprofit, a foundation, right? There are challenges with who those funders are and what they may or may not be okay with. And then there's also just the institutional pressures of what you can and can't say. And so I sort of felt like, well, one thing I have going for me, and I'm sure you relate to this as a solopreneur, independent consultant, is no one can police what I say. And so I was like, well, I feel like I'm in this position where I can say what I mean and put it out there. And so that was really where that came from.
I love it. And yes, that resonates with me all the time. It's like, who's going to fire me? Because so many places it's illegal to say equity. It's illegal to say diversity. I'm like, who's going to fire me? I'm calling it what it is.
Yep.
So yes, I completely get that. And I appreciate that. You also are speaking my language because I've said this for years I've been preaching that we do need to communicate. We need to drop some of that jargon. We can have that conversation in our circle of public health professionals, but we need to be able to have the conversation with our family members, our friends outside of public health. And it's extremely important. And there was a time when I would just kind of avoid it because it was hard to explain.
Right.
And it was just easier to just not worry about it. But we can't do that. So when it comes to community, some of the greatest successes I experienced during the pandemic, for example, in my own family was really having plain language conversations to help them understand, especially I've shared this story before, but with my elderly family members who were afraid of what this vaccine, a lot of us, public health professionals included, afraid of this vaccine and what to do. But I chose to really slow it down, have conversations with them, listen to them what their hesitations were, what their fears were, and answer their questions without telling them what to do, but just informing so that they could make those decisions. And 100% of those elderly relatives chose the vaccine. So I'm saying all that to say there's a lot that happens when you can have conversation and people are informed and they understand. And it takes a bit of we just need to get creative and slow down enough to have the conversation and really be in community.
And I think also like part of what we have lost perhaps over the years with technology and social media and all these changes to the way we communicate is sort of those really basic skills and understanding of how to have a conversation, especially in the context of disagreement, right? And I think a lot of it, exactly like you're describing, is sort of start by listening, just hear out what the other person has to say. Then you identify those common threads of where are the values that we share or the experiences that we share that can help us form a connection, right? Getting to that kind of community connection piece. And from there, it opens up a conversation. And yeah, it's not a one-directional, like, here's what you should do and you should listen to me. But it's like building that trust and that space just to have a conversation.
That's like right there is my whole masterclass. And I realize that we need more training and there needs to be more skill development in that.
I've been recommending this to everyone, no affiliation at all, but there is an author and facilitator. Her name is Priya Parker. She wrote the book Art of Gathering. I don't know if that's one that you've heard of, but she just started a Substack community called Group Life that is exactly about this. It's like we have lost the skills to connect as a group. And so this is very much like a skill building focused community, which I am really excited about having a space for that.
So I had heard of the book, but I didn't know about the Substack. So I'm making a note here. I definitely.
Yeah. It's been fantastic. She's been doing webinars every couple weeks and each is focused on like a specific skill. And yeah, I mean, I think it's so needed.
Well, that's a great resource. And knowing my team, by the time this episode comes out, they will have looked it up, found the links. It'll be in the show notes. So, but that's really wonderful resource to share. So let's talk a little bit more about the gaslit by corporations.
Yes.
Tell me what's going on.
Yeah. So I think that there are lots of ways that corporations, especially the large multinational for-profit corporations and industries, I think there are a lot of ways in which they are harming our health directly and indirectly. There are also a lot of ways in which they are gaslighting us and distracting us from recognizing that that is happening, right? And so one of my first jobs in public health after the state health department was working on evaluation of the Truth Anti-Smoking campaign. And I feel like I got a real immersion in the harm and gaslighting of the tobacco industry in particular. And that, I think, has really kind of shaped the way I then moved through my public health career in terms of being really attuned to when that kind of corporate influence was happening. And it shows up in all kinds of ways, right? So I think there are ways in which corporate interests are directly harming us by the products they manufacture. Tobacco is one prime example of that, but there are many others, right? We think about ultra-processed foods, about fossil fuels, et cetera. There are ways they're manufacturing harm directly. There are ways in which their labor practices and environmental practices are harming public health and harming communities. There are ways in which their political lobbying is preventing policies that would promote public health because they are prioritizing their profits over anything else. So there are lots of these like direct and indirect harms. And then there's the gaslighting that happens, right? I think corporations and corporate interests are a big part of what has shaped our narrative around health to be so individualistic and to be so, it's either shame on me if I have a health issue, blame you if you have a health issue. It's really focused in that way intentionally so that the attention is not put on what are those broader forces shaping the communities that we live in. And again, as I said earlier, we talk a lot about changing policies and systems. And I absolutely think that is what we need to do. But there are so many roadblocks that are put up by corporate interests to being able to change policies and systems. And so I really wanted to bring light to that, but also right alongside that, bring light to, and what is it that we can do about that? And I think that it is very easy and very natural for any of us to feel powerless in the face of these gigantic corporations, right? Like huge corporation over here and little old me over here. What could I possibly do? And I think where I really want to shift that conversation is to, yes, we often are powerless alone, but we're not powerless together. And I think to your point about we've lost some of those skills of community connection, right alongside that, in part because of that, we have also lost some of the skills around community organizing and collective action and all those other ways that we can come together with other people. But there absolutely are isolated examples of this happening, of communities that are pushing back. On the Gaslit blog, I highlighted Pittsburgh United, which is a community organizing group in Pittsburgh that pushed back against the privatization of water in their city and won that fight. And I think there are so many examples out of that story of kind of what effective community organizing and pushing back can look like. And so that's really what I'm hoping with Gaslit, is that it is ultimately a hopeful and empowering way of shifting the narrative of, and here's what we can do.
I got it. So thank you for sharing that and also pointing to the blog. And I'm sure there's another great resource that people have access to. And I think that's wonderful that you have that blog to highlight some of those stories and examples and also get people to start thinking, because some of the questions that I had before you mentioned that example, I thought, as I read those stories, I probably could find myself or parts of, like either, oh, that resonates, or maybe point to something I should check out in my own community,
Exactly. Yes.
So I think that's really wonderful. You mentioned something a little earlier about, we talk about going upstream, but we're just not going upstream far enough. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that and like what is far enough and like, a little bit more into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like I think about, our typical kind of upstream river, and I just did a talk on this. So I created the visual, so it's fresh in my mind. But, I feel like we have medical treatment for health issues, right? And then public health was like, no, we need to go upstream from that, right? And initially the conversation was around addressing social needs, right? That there are housing needs, food needs, individual needs. And I think in the healthcare system, the conversation is still there for the most part, right? How do we address these social needs of our individual patients? And that was further upstream than treating health issues once they arose. But then, right, in public health, we're like, no, we need to go further upstream, social determinants of health, right? What are the housing, the environment, the built environment? What are these things that are shaping our communities? And we need to change those. And then I feel like more recently, we have maybe inched towards talking about structural determinants like racism and governing structures that where did we get these policies and systems? It's because of these types of influences. And I think what I am saying is that let's go further upstream than talking about, those structural determinants and what is really shaping all of these things. And I think that is power. And it's this conversation of who has the power and who doesn't have the power. And I think especially about financial power, political power, and narrative power, because I think those are the types of power right now that are so influential in what policies get passed, what things get invested in, who we're prioritizing, who we're marginalizing, and what stories we're telling. And so really thinking about who has power and who doesn't have power. And I think right now, corporations and corporate interests have a lot of power in our system, and communities and fields like public health don't have a lot of power. And so thinking especially, and to me, it's really that community power piece, because if we can find a way to come together and take that collective action and put power in the hands of communities. I feel like we see this difference even when you look at like a large multinational corporation versus a small local business, right? The small local business, by virtue of being rooted in community, often, not always, but often cares about the community in addition to caring about profits. And I think what happens with the broader sort of corporate influence we're under in right now is that they care exclusively about profits and they're not rooted in community in the same way to care about our community. So figuring out how we reshift that balance.
So any ideas about how we do that as public health? Because usually you don't really hear, I definitely get what you're saying, but you think about it, how often do we hear about public health discussing power?
Exactly. This is my current soapbox. Yes, exactly. And that's my thing. I'm like, especially as public health, given what we care about, and also, quite frankly, given how frustrated I imagine many of us feel because we've been banging on the drum of policy and systems change for a long time now. And in my talk recently, this is my question to the audience. I was like, policies and systems change, absolutely 100%. Reflect on how many macro systems have you seen meaningfully and sustainably change in your career, in your public health career, right? And I'm guessing for all of us, that number is a lot smaller than we want it to be. So it's like, why is that, right? And I think, again, it goes back to power. And this is why I think public health has to treat community power not as an afterthought, but as a central strategy. Like if we want to realize the promise of public health, I think that the only path is to center community power in our strategy. And so to your question of like, how do we do that as public health, right? So I think one piece of it, right, is cultivating community connection. And this goes back to like, the group life resource I shared and other ways of like, how can we cultivate community connection? And one example I've been sharing with folks is my daughter's elementary school does a school movie night, right? Where they just like project a movie in the cafeteria, they open the space, advertise the date, right? Super simple, low lift, but it's really powerful for that school community to like feel a sense of connection, for parents to see each other and the kids and the teachers and like, So I think about this in public health a lot of like, right, where are our low lift opportunities to create space for community connection? Obviously, with Pop Health, we do a lot of work with community coalitions. I think community coalitions are a really vital place where there is an intentional effort to work across sectors, across organizations, and like foster that coordination, collaboration, right? So I think generally in public health, A, like find ways to cultivate that community connection. B, find ways to build the foundation for stronger community organizing and collective action to take place. And I know this is a place a lot of public health organizations are immediately like, but we're not allowed to advocate, right? And so I really want to draw a clear distinction between like, there are ways to build the foundation for civic engagement and organizing that don't involve you doing advocacy, right? So like, how do we, and honestly, cultivating community connection as part of that foundation, but also things like, can we build the capacity of our community members to tell their stories? Can we create spaces for our community members to be in the same time and space as decision makers, as policymakers? What can we do to foster those opportunities to make connections that are going to ultimately make community organizing more effective, right? And that goes for bringing community organizations together too. A lot of the coalitions we work with at Pop Health do this, right? They're conveners. So they're like, hey, this organization is looking for, someone to come advocate with them on this issue. Hey, this other organization has been talking about this too. Let's connect them, right? Like there are ways that we can convene and connect in our communities that helps push forward the organizing efforts that are happening. So I think there's that. And then I think there's the narrative shift we've been talking about, like, who better than those of us in public health to reshape the narrative around what shapes our health and to be more explicit about where the harm and gaslighting is coming from and where the power could lie to really start getting to what public health promises, which is, transformative change to our community health and well-being.
It's wonderful to hear you explain that. And I get excited because I see where I was explaining to you a little earlier about this initiative that I have. So on the podcast, we have this series we've launched, what is public health, really helping to communicate in plain language. I'm pulling these, people that are brave enough and courageous enough in public health to come and speak their piece and explain it and start to break it down. So, and my thought is really to be able to, infusing their stories, leveraging the platform of this podcast and collecting these stories. And because I kept hearing, well, we don't understand, we need the stories. Well, really sharing them in a space that makes it easy for people to pull from these stories and use them. So as you're describing, and answering my question about how we can go further upstream and how can we do this as public health, I feel like this initiative that I'm pushing for helping us explain in plain language fits into that, because it is a part of how we rebuild and how we changing the narratives. Like maybe if they thought it was just this one thing, changing that to really see it and really bringing some of that power, because we've existed well in the background and been okay with that. But that's not okay, because it's not yielding any power.
That's right. That's right. And you said this earlier when we were talking, but yeah, it's like when we don't tell our stories, it becomes all the easier for resources to be taken away, funding to be cut, and for there not to be public support for this, right? This is a big part of why I continue to come back to this idea of community organizing and community power as the only way out of the messes we're in. And it's because to change a policy, you need pretty widespread public support for that to happen, right? Especially in a context where many of maybe all of our policymakers and politicians have taken money from whatever combination of sources. So they're not going to feel particularly compelled to pass a policy that is going to the big, powerful influences are opposing, unless there is widespread community support for it. And how do we get widespread community support, right? We got to get the story out. And it also goes back to your part about clear, simple, understandable messaging. And not just clear, simple, understandable, but also compelling, attention grabbing. That's not I don't know. I feel like people see it, and this is true even in political conversations, right? I think people see sort of these efforts at branding of that kind of compelling, attention-grabbing messaging. I think people sometimes see it as a distraction from the issues, but really we can't push forward the issues if we don't have those things, if we're not if we don't have the branding and the compelling messaging and the attention grabbing things, we can't advance the issues. So it's actually, it all goes hand in hand.
This is fascinating. I appreciate you sharing your passion, your vision, and really breaking this down. And I think that especially now so we're recording this in the fall of 2025, putting it into context in case someone's listening to this a year from now and looking back. But, this has been a hard year, and we feel beat up and drained. What can we do? And conversations like this, hearing you, is inspiring, because I feel like now it's giving a little bit of, there's a little light, there's some things that we can do, and just reminding us of that collective fire. I think these are things that we know because we teach this out, but turning it back and really reminding us of these things. And it makes me feel good. I'm even more inspired to continue with this momentum with the series that I'm talking about, because I really believe strongly that we get more buy-in. I think if each of us could just make sure that our family and friends really understood public health through the lens of whatever our special area is, that goes a long way with that buy-in from the community, like you were just describing, that can help change policy and help do all these other things and help people really start to understand, and that shift toward the power, really bringing the community together. I'm excited to bring these resources together for the podcast episode. As we begin to wrap up, let's hear about your newsletter, because I think that this will be a great way for people that are listening at this point and deciding, okay, how do I stay connected? Because I'm going to subscribe as well, because I didn't know about it until we were talking just now. But tell us about your newsletter.
Absolutely. So yes, you can go to gaslitbycorporations.com to find the newsletter sign up. So this is our Gaslit newsletter. And the hope here is really to share those stories of communities that are reclaiming their power, to share action steps that you can take in your own life and in your own communities to ignite change, and to highlight all sides of the corporate power equation. I've shared certainly stories of corporate harm and gaslighting, but also one of our recent blog posts was highlighting some corporate leaders who are getting it right and what that looks like, right? So really hoping that this is a newsletter that can bring both hope and inspiration, as you were talking about, but also some concrete action steps and resources and strategies and tools that people can use. Gaslit is in its very early stages, right? So right now we've got the blog, the newsletter really focused on this narrative piece and conversations like this one to share that. But there are a lot of directions we are exploring in terms of what action and fostering action in this space can look like, both in terms of bringing together community organizations and advocacy groups that are fighting corporate power to, kind of a community of practice, learn from each other sort of model. We're exploring that. Also exploring, just other ways to get people directly connected to work that's happening in their communities. So
wonderful. That sounds great. I'll make sure that we have links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming back on the podcast, for giving us the update, and for this engaging, this really fiery conversation that really leaves me feeling very inspired. So I wish you all the best with everything that you're doing. I know we're going to stay in touch. And if there's ever anything that I can do to be of service or support, please let me know. We're, like you said, we're in this together, and this is about how we come together to advance public health.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate these conversations and what you're doing with your podcast, with the This is Public Health series. I really do think that shifting that narrative, and also what you said about, if each of us had our friends and family understanding this work and what we do, I do think that is the starting point for everything else. So really appreciate what you were doing as well. And thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as we did. I encourage you to connect with Dr. Ilakkuvan and learn more about the work that she's doing. I also encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter that she discussed as well. You can find the links to connect with her on the show notes page. Now, the show notes page for this episode, which is episode 434, can be found at phecpodcast.com. Once you're there, just navigate to episode 434 to find its show notes. One more thing before you go. Remember that our podcast now has an app where we can continue the conversations from episodes like this one with public health professionals around the world. You can download our PHEC Podcast Community App in Apple or Google Play Store. You can also visit phecpodcastcommunity.com to join the community on desktop. All right, everyone. Until next time, have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you for listening. The show notes page is where you'll find links to everything we discussed in this episode. To find the show notes for all of our podcast episodes, just visit phecpodcast.com.